Hey friends, want to see something cool? I'm going to show you all the states that I drove Juanita through in 2021, and then I will spend some time going in detail about specific places I visited and my route. So if you want to watch the whole video, you'll get a detailed explanation of where I've been this year. But quickly, I'll show you that, of course, I picked up the van in Michigan. I did a test run early this year down in Ohio before actually hitting the road. When I left Michigan for the trip in March, I drove across Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and landed in Arizona. Spent some time there, looped up into Utah, Colorado, back to New Mexico, back to Arizona before driving through Nevada to get to California. Drove through Oregon, spent some time in Washington, then Idaho, Montana, back into Idaho for a little bit before driving across Wyoming, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, through the UP, and landed in Michigan this summer. When I hit the road again in fall, I drove up through the UP across Ontario and Quebec to get to Maine, then did a blitz through New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, spent some time in North Carolina, drove through South Carolina, Georgia, spent time in Alabama and Florida, drove through Mississippi, Louisiana, spent a weekend at the Texas Renaissance Festival, a couple weeks in New Mexico, was in Arizona last month, and I did a day trip down to Mexico, but did not drive across the border with Juanita. I just parked at the border and walked across, spent some time in California, and now I'm just kind of hanging around in the Southwest, chasing warm weather until I can figure out what 2022 is going to look like. So if you're still watching, I'll show you my route, but I want to point out 38 states in 2021. That includes 2 countries, 2 provinces. I'm feeling pretty proud of all the miles Juanita and I have covered. I did the math and it is roughly 20,000 miles. So when I purchased Juanita last fall, it was in West Michigan. And then at the beginning of this year, in February, I did a test run down to Hocking Hills, Ohio, so I could get familiar with the van before actually hitting the road. When I left in March, and I'm going to try and follow the months of the videos that I've been posting with the highlight reel, drove across the center of the country, landed in northern Arizona at a spot called Marple Canyon. I loved this place, one of my favorite spots of this trip. After Marple Canyon, I circled around, visited a friend in Santa Fe and Las Cruces. By April, I had driven west to Tucson, where I spent a couple of weeks, up into Prescott Valley, Arizona, across Nevada, drove through Las Vegas because I'd never seen that town. And then into California, I went about 5 days at a nature preserve near Bakersfield before I drove through the coast. Somewhere in here is where I found the Elephant Seal Beach, drove up Highway 1 and did an overnight at Redwood State Park, which was a huge bucket list item for me. So now we're at the beginning of May. I spent a couple of weeks in Mount Shasta, California, which is going to be a dear place in my heart. I loved that spot as well. Drove up through Oregon and spent some time in Washington visiting family and friends. I spent 2 weeks camping out in Olympic National Park on the coast there, and that was the most restorative and peaceful part of this whole trip. Getting to see the rocky shoreline every day and take hikes through moss-covered rainforest was such a treat. I went from Olympic National Park up to Port Angeles, Washington, and spent Memorial Weekend on kind of the middle east side of Washington State, doing morel mushroom hunting. So beginning of June, I landed in Bellingham, Washington. I took Juanita on a car ferry across these islands here, which was fun. And then after Bellingham, I drove through North Cascades National Park, but it must not be passable right now because of winter weather and the snow in the mountains. But I will say that I drove from North Cascades through this town of Winthrop, which is a fun, like country western themed town, and then checked out Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which was an unexpectedly gorgeous spot before landing near Glacier National Park. Now, at this time, Glacier National Park was hard to navigate. You had to have reservations to enter from the west side. And so I ended up camping in Rexford, Montana, about 6 miles south of the Canadian border for a week, and really bummed that I didn't get to stay there for 2 weeks. I was planning on it, but got pushed out from a heat wave where temperatures were getting up to 105 degrees here. So after Rexford, this is now the beginning of July, I made my way toward Yellowstone National Park, spent a couple, actually about a week down here, drove through the park and across Wyoming. I'll back up and say at West Yellowstone, my propane tank caught on fire. And so I tried to stay on the road for about another week after that, but the propane supply powers my refrigerator. It of course allows me to cook on my 2-burner stove. So without having a working fridge and without having a working stove, I decided to head back toward Michigan. The middle of July is when I landed back in Michigan. So I drove through, spent about a week in South Dakota. That's where I was trying to figure out if I could enjoy being on the road without my propane tank. And then went through the UP, did some camping in northern Michigan before I landed back in Grand Ledge in the Lansing area and Saline in the Ann Arbor area for the end of the summer and beginning of the fall. When I hit the road again at the end of September, I drove north up into the UP, spent about a week on the shores of Whitefish Bay. There's a campground up here called Bayview Campground that I would highly recommend. And then did this route that I've never driven across Ontario before, and spent some time in Quebec, had some experiences where I needed to use my broken French because gas station pumps were all in French or folks weren't speaking English. And that was a cool experience. Landed in Maine, another spot that I would have gladly stayed for 2 weeks, but only spent a week there, was Jonesport, beautiful harbor town. And then here comes my blitz down the East Coast. So other area that I would have loved to have had an extended stay was Jackson Lake Island with the goats and the movie set of Big Fish here in Alabama. You can see I rounded up my circle of the country by driving across Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico. Last month when I was in Arizona, I did that day trip down to Mexico. And now I'm just kind of waiting to see what 2022 is going to look like. It's hard to make plans for the future when everything still seems unknown. So I'm trying to be at peace with going with the flow and waiting until things return back to normal. You can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes.